The reading from Emmett Fox for June the 5th, Only Your Own Thoughts is the title. No matter what problem you may have to face today, there is a solution, because you have nothing to deal with but your own thoughts. And as you know, you have the power to select and control your thoughts, difficult though it may be at times to do so. As long as you think that your destiny is in the hands of other people, the situation is hopeless. Remind yourself constantly that you have nothing to deal with but your own thoughts. Write it down where you will see it often. Have it on your desk, hang it in your bedroom, write it on your pocketbook. Write it on your soul. It will transform your life. It will lead you out of the land of Egypt and out of the house of bondage. It will bring you to God. There's a short scripture from Psalm 119. I thought on my ways and turned my feet unto thy testimonies. Only your own thoughts.
Thank you. Today I'm going to talk about vulnerability as a guardian of our integrity, but it's going to look like we're going sort of sideways for a bit, and please bear with me because it'll become clear in a minute. But I want to start by acknowledging why it felt right to talk about it today. The previous two talks about dealing with the little deaths in our lives and other lives, and the ministry of comfort, what I saw among us was such intense openness, sharing, personal vulnerability, and sharing with our congregation pieces of ourselves that were painful memories, or that were sensitive, or left us one way or another vulnerable. And then to have this concept presented to me, it only felt right that this was an appropriate way. First, I want to recognize and acknowledge how rare it is to have a community where people have enough trust to share of their inmost hearts. God bless every one of you for being here and being part of this sharing. Thank you, thank you. And I encourage you, do treasure it, because it's not easy to find situations or people where you can feel safe sharing your inmost part. Heck, there's enough times when we have trouble being vulnerable to ourselves. But what I want to do is first present some of the thoughts of theologians, of noted thinkers about vulnerability. Because if you go on the internet, there's all this discussion of why vulnerability is good. And so I want to cover that a bit before we move to the next step, which is not talked about so much. One website quoted from Psalm 32, and it says TPT. I don't know what that translation is, but here's what it reads: "Before I confessed my sins, I kept it all inside. My dishonesty devastated my inner life, causing my life to be filled with frustration, irrepressible anguish, and misery. The pain never let up, for your hand of conviction was heavy on my heart. My strength was sapped, my inner life dried up like a spiritual drought within my soul." Keeping it all inside is trying to stay invulnerable. And then a community, a website committed to nonviolent action, or nonviolence as a way of interrelating in the world, had an article, and it started out, ask yourself a simple question: what is a good baby? Now, if you've been raised in the Western culture, chances are you know the answer right away, whether or not you agree with it. A good baby is one that doesn't cry. So the training against vulnerability starts very early in life. Then the author goes on to say, it is no surprise then that most of us wear many layers of protection and know the experience of contraction, of a desire to hide what is true inside. And yet many of us know that as we loosen the protection and become more naked, we come closer to how we once were, to our essential humanity. And when we recognize this complex truth, the author says, we can begin to imagine choosing moment by moment how much protection would be helpful and how much protection is keeping us away from the flow of life. She sort of summarizes, fear of vulnerability is one of the core obstacles to inner freedom. And a physician philosopher named Rachel Remen says, the choice is never between slavery and freedom. We will always have to choose between slavery and the unknown. If we embrace the possibility of opening up and remaining soft in the face of whatever comes our way, then we actually grow in our capacity to be ourselves in full. So this gives you an idea of what the argument is. There's another article that simply starts with why vulnerability is your greatest asset in life. And it's arguing, without allowing ourselves to be vulnerable, we can't experience the joy and rapture of life. We can't be our authentic selves, and we can't be human, because to be human is to be imperfect. So, and then Brené Brown from the Center for Action and Contemplation talks about the vulnerability complex. It's the first thing I look for in you, and the last thing I want you to see in me. So, what they're all saying, and what so many other articles on the web say, is basically, without vulnerability, you're not connecting to the divine. You're not able to connect to the divine. Another one wrote, why the hell would I want to make myself vulnerable? And then this author went through a listing of a bunch of different reasons, which I'm going to hit very quickly. Embracing vulnerability allows you to feel more connected with other people and thus to build more satisfying bonds. It improves your romantic and intimate relationships by making you more emotionally available. I can personally speak, as I've allowed myself to become less defensed. I think I can say my relationship with this wonderful woman has improved, though she may differ. Embracing vulnerability allows you to be more authentic and honest with yourself and with others. It opens many doors to you that otherwise would have remained shut if you had kept yourself closed off. It allows you to be challenged and thus grow, learn, and be strengthened. This is a common theme, by the way, that by allowing ourselves to be vulnerable, we also allow ourselves growth. That if we are walled off, if we are creating barriers, we are forestalled from growth. And then, again from Rachel Remen, the harder we work to protect ourselves from experiencing loss, the less we can fully experience life and love. And I'll add to that, and the spiritual connection with the divine. Then Richard Rohr, whom most of you know is one of my favorite reference points, in one of his articles said, did you ever imagine that what we call vulnerability might just be the key to ongoing growth? In my experience, he says, healthily vulnerable people use every occasion to expand, change, and grow. Yet it is a risky proposition to live undefended in a kind of constant openness to the other, because it means others could sometimes wound us. Indeed, he says, vulnerable comes from the Latin for to wound. But only if we take this risk, he says, do we also allow the opposite possibility, that the other might also gift us, free us, and even love us. The poet David White, whom I referenced last week, in a conversation I heard on the radio show On Being, emphasized how one of our goals in the spiritual walk is to have conversations with God, conversations with those around us. That we cannot have conversations, real conversations, if we're walled off. That's walled off to my wife, walled off to those around, walled off to the divine in all of the forms of divine. So then he summarizes later, it seems to be the work of the Spirit to keep you vulnerable to life and love itself, and to resist all that destroys life flow. And he made a point here that I'd not thought about, so it's a little off topic, but I'm going to use it anyway. Notice he says that the major metaphors for spirit are always dynamic, energetic, and moving. Elusive wind, descending dove, falling fire, flowing water. Spirit-led people never stop growing and changing and recognizing each new moment of opportunity. How strange it is to think that so much of religion became worship of the status quo and neurotic fear of failure. It does make sense, though, when we consider that the ego, now this is him stating, not me, that the ego hates and fears change and failure. So what then is the path to holiness? It is the same as the path to wholeness. And we are never there yet. We are always just in the river. You don't push the river or make the river happen. It is always happening, and you cannot stop it. Now, Emmett Fox, in one of his writings, one that was read several months ago, God is always in the process of unfolding. So, I've talked about all the arguments for allowing vulnerability, the virtues of being vulnerable. But I really haven't directly addressed integrity. So let's talk about that now, because I think it tends to be overlooked. We don't really want to pretend it's not important, even though other people are not dealing so much with it. To put it simply, you cannot have integrity or be integrity unless you have let go of your barricades, your protections against others seeing your imperfect human self. And for many of us, our protections also against ourselves seeing and acknowledging our imperfect being. Think on that for a minute. Anytime we're trying to put on the dog, pretend something we're not living in integrity. And neither the person seeing us nor the divine can reach us. If you want to look at a horrific example, look at the recent scandal and the report at the Southern Baptist Convention of how all those who were the leaders, allegedly the leaders of the Christian faith guiding others, were in fact simply devoted to putting up barricades so nobody could know where the flaws were. Flaws that injured so many people. Flaws that even brought what good the Baptist faith has into utter disrepute. In our walk through life, as people following a spiritual path, and a path that is not defined by a religion or in fact, in a sense, does not define itself, because the divine does not define itself. It is especially important that we live a life of integrity. The Quakers, small group that they were in the 15 and 1600s, changed all of British society, and by and large Western society, certainly in the United States, about ethics, because they lived life of integrity. They did not speak an untruth. They lived truthfully, they lived simply, they lived honorably. And it got to the point, most of them were merchants. They came from the merchant class by and large. Got to the point that a stranger coming into a town needing to buy provisions would always ask who the local Quaker merchant was, because the stranger knew that the Quaker merchant would charge him or her the same fee that he charged the next door neighbor. And mothers needing something from the store now felt safe sending one of their little ones, because it was no longer a question of how high the price could be gouged. The little one would be paying the same price as if mother had gone. They were living lives of integrity. If you asked them about their faith, they would talk about it. They were somewhat evangelical. But the truth was, people knew that this was a person of integrity. Each of us can walk that life of integrity. And I expect you do, because that's the ethos of who we are in this little community. Now, I will differentiate between living a life of integrity and putting yourself at needless risk. There are toxic people, dangerous people, where you sure as hell want to make sure your protections are up. Doesn't mean you can't pray for them. Doesn't mean, given an opportunity, you can't speak with integrity and with vulnerability. But even there, you're being vulnerable and having integrity by taking care of yourself, because you yourself are valuable in the eyes of God. And you must protect yourself as a part of the divine. So, that said, that's why I talk about vulnerability as a guardian of integrity. And the conversations you have, as David White, the poet, says, with others, with the divine, within yourself, by being vulnerable, by acknowledging that we're human, that you're human, that I'm human, that we're not perfection, but we're doing the best we can. That's how we can spread good to the world and continue our own growth and change and moving ever closer to a reflection of pure divine love. And that is the most basic calling of why we're here.